Hello, my name is Mark Tredinnick. I'm a poet and a friend of the faculty. I've taught on the BCII a number of years, and the method cards about poetry are mine. And this presentation precedes an exercise where we'd like you to put one of those, more or less, to play. So this is an argument for poetry as a method for seeing deeply and seditiously, and for speaking slant and engagingly. Metaphor is the chief craft in all of that. So these slides are leading up to that point. Here's a poem. You can read that at your leisure. It's one of mine. That's what poems look like. That's how they work. So I want to speak, as I say, about poetry not just as a genre, but as a way of being in the world, and as a way of seeing the world, thinking about it, understanding it deeply. Wisdom is the work that poetry performs. I'll speak about how poetry, in other words, might be understood as a practice, and we'd like you to think about it as a methodology. That might seem bizarre to some of you, but I hope it seems less bizarre at the end of this. It is, above all things, a way of being in the world and of paying attention to it and to yourself. It's a methodology for a subversive kind of seeing and a deeper kind of speaking. Its chief practice is metaphor, and its chief virtue is its openness of mind. It keeps the mind open for long enough. An argument for poetry is that it's the antidote to the inadequacy of every other discourse, the idiom of every other professional approach, which fails inevitably to make an account of what it feels like to be human in a chaotic world. Poetry does that work, and we need the poem, in other words, because of the dominance of the market. Paul Eluard, 100 and some years ago, said there is another world. It is this one. In other words, there's something in our lived experience that doesn't escape our felt sense, but does not find its way into most of our accounts. There is a reality that eludes all of the other discourses because they have no language to account for the data of lived experience. Poetry does, on the other hand, metaphor, speech music in particular. Poetry is a discipline of being with ourselves in the world. It uses language in a particular way that allows us to make an account of that. In other words, it puts us back inside the world beyond our heads and beyond our knowing. To get at this a little deeper, science knows, we all know, that there is always far more going on in any moment or relationship, issue, organism, complex system, wicked problem, beautiful question, far more going on than we can begin to comprehend or apprehend in the first place. Poetry, though, is good at catching some of the rest of all of that. Phenomenology, if I can wind this back just a tiny bit further, a philosophical school, which might be seen as the version in philosophy of what poetry is in the world, offers us a way of understanding what I mean by this data, this rich but elusive data that only poetry captures. It says, before anything, any problem, any relationship, any place, any piece of country means it is. And we need to practice a certain way of looking that brackets off our preconceptions in order to apprehend the life world of that instance of being. This is where art comes in. And what poetry does in particular is that it allows us a means of staying and saying that world, of slowing it, in other words, so that we can inhabit it like a tent or a small room. And of course, poems make small rooms. Before we rush to judgment, poetry as a way of seeing will stay us and keep our mind open long enough perhaps to perceive the data that we're going to need. The poet Rumi, way back, Persian poet who wrote in Farsi, says, before ideas of right and wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there. That's a way of understanding what poetry is, that field. Don't just do something, in other words, says the poem, stand there. Participate in the wild order of the thing at hand. Seamus Heaney says in a poem, that day I'll be in step with all that escapes me. It's poetry's hope to put us back in step with this kind of data that mostly escapes the account we make of our lives and mostly escapes almost our notice. The data that poetry will help us catch, and that I want you to think about catching in your beautiful questions, is what it means to live in time and in love and in loss and in confusion, in the beautiful trouble of it all. Poetry can help one sense, value, and give weight, in other words, to that kind of data. Let's call it lyric data. And it can do it. Why? Because it speaks slant, and because it induces, through the slantness of speech that it wants, the originality and freshness. It induces originality and freshness of seeing. The saying, in other words, schools the seeing. So poetry is a language that wants us not just to reason and to make sense, but it wants us to make love, to make music, to make fun and mischief and prayer and riddle and oracle. And because it shakes up our saying, it shakes up, I want to suggest to you, our seeing, and makes it slant. The method card we wanted to use in a moment is called Tell All the Truth But Tell It Slant. That phrasing belongs to Emily Dickinson. What does it mean? I'll say just a little bit about that. Essentially metaphor, but some other things as well. My sense is that to tell something slant, to see it at an angle, is to make an angle in your seeing and your saying that invites you or anyone else who's concerned with your conversation about this to stand and stay a little longer, so that some wisdom might dawn, some other data might catch the attention that's normally too hasty. The Spanish have a way of talking about thinking with one's heart and feeling with one's head. They call it sente pensante, and that's the mode of the poet. Chiefly what slant means is freshness and originality. So poetry's great gift to us is that it frees us from cliche and commonplace expression. And in doing that, because we live inside language, it frees up our seeing to make it fresh. So slant perception is original, arresting, original. I said original twice there. It's unexpected. It avoids the commonplace. Poetry, in other words, is thinking and perceiving. It's cognition with an openness of mind. And Seamus Heaney, again, a great Irish poet of the world, said once, poetry refuses the intellect's eagerness to foreclose. It refuses the intellect's eagerness to foreclose. It keeps the mind open, as that slide says, long enough to let the real world in, that data I spoke of before. Poetry is what happens when we ask more of language, and when we ask more of language, we ask more of ourselves, find more in ourselves, find more in the world than we thought was there. We suspected it was, but we didn't know. It reveals to us the world as much more than we thought it was. Another argument for poetry's general utility is that we are languaging animals, arguably. Language defines us. So it follows that the better the language, the better we are. The better the language, the better we see. So these would be the tricks of telling it slant. So think about all of these when you take the method card to work in life and in this activity. Many of these are musical. So poetry wants good rhythm. It wants good speech music. So assonance, alliteration, onomatopoeia, crash, in other words. Poetry, though this doesn't have to concern you very much outside poetry, trades in architecture, in form, in other words. And form works on the language to compress it and make it intense. Poetry wants you to lodge every idea, every abstraction that you're concerned with in an image, in something concrete. Poetry wants you to remember the natural world beyond the human. No good poem doesn't reference a bird or some piece of nature or the seasons. Poetry wants you to work in cool verbal moves. These are called figures of speech, tropes. Poetry is radically trim, and poetry trades in metonym and metaphor. Now, this is where I want you to focus your attention. Chiefly. The power of metonym and metaphor is that they help us to see relationally, almost ecologically. So metonym is when we find a way to speak of an abstract thing as a concrete reality or something close to concrete. So when, for example, Emily Dickinson speaks of hope, she refers to it as the thing with feathers. That's a classic instance of metonymy. And so is referring to the emotion as the heart and to literature as the pen. So think about maybe some metonyms that might help you make your casting of your beautiful question mesmerizing. and engaging, first to you and then to anyone else. And metaphor and metonym are kin, and they're both at the heart of telling things slant. Metaphor simply gives you thing A as if it were thing B. It says, imagine life as if it were a waking dream. Imagine my heart as if it were an exile. Imagine my mind as a pilgrim. The lake at dusk, well, that was a mirror day died in. The purpose of metaphor is to bring the imagination as well as critical thought to the process of thinking about whatever it is that we're talking about. All right, so there's poetry and there's metaphor, and its work is to divine data that otherwise will escape your notice, so that you'll inform a deeper understanding of your question and inform your readers more deeply. There's another poem of mine. I'll leave that up there for you to contemplate, and I wish you well.